I went camping alone in the late summer of 2022, deep in the mountains of northern Montana. I'd planned it for months. 3 nights by myself, no phone signal, no other campers around, just the sound of the wind through the pines and the rush of a nearby creek. I'd been craving that silence for a long time. I had been feeling burned out from work, tired of the constant noise and people everywhere. I just wanted to be alone for a while. I picked a remote site I found on a map, about 2 hours off the main road, right by a small clearing with a stream that curved around a thick stand of trees. The drive up there was rough, unpaved roads, loose gravel, and narrow switchbacks. When I finally reached the clearing, it felt like I had stepped completely out of the world. There were no power lines, no trails, not even signs of old fire pits. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the trees were tall enough to block most of the sky. I pitched my tent near the water, built a small fire ring with rocks, and unpacked everything neatly. Sleeping bag, cooler, small folding chair, flashlight, and a knife I always carried on solo trips. Everything felt normal and peaceful at first. That first night was quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I could hear the steady hiss of the stream and the occasional rustle of something small in the brush, maybe a raccoon or rabbit. I remember lying in my sleeping bag, staring at the tent ceiling while the fire outside died down, feeling that mix of calm and tension that comes with being completely alone. I fell asleep easily. The next morning, I spent a few hours walking around the area. The forest was dense but beautiful. Sunlight came through the trees in narrow beams. The air smelled sharp and clean. I collected some fallen branches for firewood and noticed faint tire tracks in the dirt near where I'd parked my car. They didn't look fresh, but they also weren't old enough to have been erased by rain. It struck me as odd, because I hadn't seen a single car for hours on my way in. I shrugged it off, figuring maybe hunters or Forest Service workers had passed through recently. Around noon, I heard what sounded like a car engine far off in the distance. It was faint, barely there, but I remember freezing for a moment. I waited, listening, but it faded. There wasn't supposed to be anyone that far in, especially not in the middle of the week. I told myself it was probably coming from miles away. Sound carried strangely through those hills. That night, I built another fire and cooked a simple meal: canned beans, some bread, and coffee. The woods grew darker faster than I expected, the air cooling quickly. I remember noticing the way the wind had changed direction, blowing steadily from deeper in the forest. I could smell something faint on it, like burnt rubber or old oil. I thought maybe there had been an old vehicle somewhere in the woods. When I turned off my headlamp to look at the stars, I saw nothing but darkness through the trees. It was pitch black, and even with the fire going, the edges of the clearing felt like they were swallowing the light. I went to bed not long after. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. The air felt colder. I could hear the wind again, but there was another sound. Faint, rhythmic, out of place. It was a metallic tapping, coming from somewhere past the creek. It wasn't fast, just a slow, steady clink, pause, clink, pause. My first thought was that a branch was hitting something metal, but there was nothing man-made out there that I'd seen. I lay completely still, barely breathing, trying to pick out the direction. It sounded like it was moving, not closer but across, like someone slowly walking parallel to my campsite. After about a minute, the sound stopped. I didn't move. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. The wind picked up again, and I told myself it had to be something natural, maybe a branch or a loose piece of old fence. But I hadn't seen any signs of fencing or structures anywhere around. I eventually drifted back to sleep, but not deeply. Every small noise after that made my stomach tighten. The next morning, when I stepped outside the tent, I noticed something strange right away. There were scuff marks near the edge of the creek. Not animal tracks, but more like boot prints, though half faded from the damp soil. They looked recent. One set crossed the shallow water and led into the trees on the other side. I crouched down, staring at them for a long time. They weren't mine. I hadn't crossed there. I tried to convince myself it could have been old, from someone passing through before me, but the soil was still soft from dew. Those prints hadn't been there the day before. That day I couldn't relax. I didn't hike far. I stayed near my tent, trying to focus on reading a book I'd brought, but every sound in the woods seemed louder, more deliberate. Around noon, I heard what sounded like snapping branches, faint but distinct, somewhere in the trees behind my tent. It happened once, then silence. I waited for birds to start up again, but nothing. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I thought about packing up and leaving early, but part of me didn't want to overreact. I'd camped alone plenty of times before and had spooked myself for no reason. I told myself I'd leave in the morning if I still felt uneasy. When night came, I couldn't shake the tension. I built a fire again, but the light felt useless, like it wasn't enough to keep anything away. I sat by it for hours, just listening. The woods were almost silent except for the stream. I finally went into my tent around midnight, zipped the flap, and tried to sleep with the flashlight close to my side. I left it off, not wanting to drain the battery. Sometime later, I don't know what time, I woke up again. This time I knew what had woken me. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, unmistakable. Not animal. They were on the dry pine needles just outside the tent, moving carefully. I froze instantly, my eyes open in the dark. I could hear someone shifting their weight, the soft crunch of steps circling halfway around my tent. Then silence. My mouth went dry. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I was too afraid even to unzip the sleeping bag. The footsteps started again, just a few, then stopped right by my car. I heard the faint metallic click of the door handle being tested. My car was locked. Then more silence. I don't know how long I lay there like that. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. Eventually, I heard nothing else. I stayed awake until the sky began to lighten. When it was finally bright enough, I crawled out of the tent, my hands shaking. The ground near my car was covered in disturbed needles and faint prints. Boots again, clearly visible this time. Whoever it was had walked all around my sight. I checked the car. Both handles had dirt smudges on them. Nothing was broken, but the fuel door was slightly open. That was enough for me. I packed everything as fast as I could, barely eating anything. I kept looking over my shoulder at the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there. The woods were still dead quiet, even as I slammed the trunk shut. When I finally started the car, I realized how far I was from anyone else. The forest road felt endless. Every turn, I kept checking my mirrors, convinced someone was following me. When I reached the main road, I pulled over and got out just to breathe. There was no cell signal yet, but the feeling of being out in the open again was overwhelming. I stayed there for a few minutes before continuing. I didn't stop until I reached a small town about 40 miles away. I parked behind a gas station, went inside, and told the clerk that someone had been out near my camp the previous night. He told me I wasn't the first person to say that. A few months earlier, a hiker had reported seeing a man living off the grid in those same woods. No tent, no car, just moving through campsites at night, stealing food and gear, sometimes just watching people. That was enough confirmation for me. I never went back to that area again. Even now, when I think about it, the part that unsettles me most isn't that someone was there. It's that whoever it was didn't take anything. They didn't try to hurt me. They just walked around, tested my car, stood near my tent, and left. Like they wanted me to know I wasn't alone out there. I went camping in early October, alone, in a section of national forest in Oregon I hadn't visited before. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing near an old dirt service road that I'd found on a topographic map. The spot looked perfect when I arrived. Flat ground, surrounded by tall pine and fir trees, a shallow creek about 50 feet away, and no signs that anyone else had been there recently. It was exactly what I wanted. Isolation, quiet, no cell signal, no noise except the forest. I got there in the late afternoon. The sun was already low behind the trees, the light golden and thin. The air smelled sharp, like sap and cold earth. I unpacked my gear slowly, enjoying the silence. I pitched my tent close to a fallen log that looked like a good seat, then gathered dry branches and made a small fire ring with rocks. I'd done this 100 times before. Everything about it felt normal. When darkness fell, it got cold fast. I sat by the fire, eating from a small pan, and watched the flames bounce light off the trees. It was the kind of silence where you could hear the faintest sound for miles. The fire crackled softly, and the creek made a quiet rushing sound that came and went with the wind. I stayed up late, staring into the flames until they burned down to embers, then crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep easily. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up without knowing why. The air inside the tent felt colder than before, and the forest was absolutely silent. Not even the creek. That was what struck me first. The rushing sound was gone. I listened hard, waiting for it to start again, but it didn't. There was no wind either, no rustling, just a strange stillness that made my skin crawl. Then, I heard a sound, soft, muffled, from somewhere near the creek. It was faint but distinct, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. It lasted only a few seconds, then stopped. My first thought was that an animal might be pulling a branch, but the sound had rhythm to it, almost deliberate. I held my breath, listening. Nothing else. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep, though it felt like hours later. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. The creek sounded fine, birds were chirping, the sun was up. I tried to brush off what I'd heard as something simple, a deer maybe, but when I went down to the creek to wash my hands, I noticed something strange in the mud. Deep grooves, like something heavy had been pulled along the edge of the water. They ran for about 10 feet, then disappeared into the brush. There were no paw prints nearby, just the long, dragging marks. I stood there for a while, staring at them. I didn't like how they looked. The spacing was wide, and the lines were uneven, as if whatever made them had shifted weight while moving. I convinced myself it had to be something natural, a fallen branch being pushed by wind or water, though deep down I didn't believe it. I spent the rest of the day hiking around the area, trying to enjoy the trip, but I couldn't stop thinking about those marks. The woods felt different now. Every sound seemed sharper. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows shifting between trees, but every time I turned, there was nothing. I told myself I was just on edge because I was alone. When night came again, I built a fire bigger than the first night. I didn't like the dark silence the night before, so I wanted more light. I sat close to the flames, the warmth on my face, and kept glancing toward the creek. Around 10 p.m., I noticed something that made me uneasy. The forest had gone completely silent again. No insects, no wind, no water sounds, just the pop of the fire. I stared into the darkness beyond the tree line for what felt like an hour. At one point, I thought I saw movement, a quick shift of something pale between two trees, far back where the firelight didn't reach. I told myself it was a trick of light or maybe an animal's flank reflecting the flames, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there. Eventually, I forced myself to get into the tent. I left my lantern on its dimmest setting, sitting near the door, because I couldn't stand total darkness. I lay there listening, every small creak of the tent fabric making me tense. Sometime later, I don't know how long, I heard it again. The dragging sound, this time closer. It came from the direction of the creek, moving slowly toward the camp. The sound would stop for a few seconds, then start again, like someone pulling a sack over dry leaves. My heart was hammering. I didn't move, barely even breathed. After a minute, the sound stopped completely. The silence was worse. Then came the softest crunch of footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They weren't the light, scurrying steps of an animal. These were deep, with weight behind them. I could hear them circling the tent. My throat went dry. I wanted to unzip the tent and look out, but I couldn't make myself do it. I just stayed there, frozen, staring at the faint light of the lantern through the fabric. The steps stopped behind the tent. I could feel the air shift slightly, like someone standing just outside. I heard another sound, a faint metallic noise, like something brushing against metal. It was coming from where my fire pit was. My cooking pan and tools were sitting there. The metallic scraping came again, slow, deliberate. Then, nothing. The sound stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, but there was no more movement. Eventually, the exhaustion caught up with me, and I drifted off in short, uneasy bursts of sleep. When I woke up, the lantern had gone out, and the first light of dawn was creeping through the tent. I got out immediately. My fire pit was cold, and my gear had been disturbed. The pan was on the ground a few feet from where I left it. My cooler lid was open. Nothing was missing, but it had clearly been touched. I looked around the perimeter and saw them again, boot prints. Not mine. The tread was different, narrower, longer, and they came from the creek, looped around my tent, and went back toward the trees. At that point, my nerves were shot. I decided to pack up and leave early. As I was folding the tent, I noticed something near the tree line. A piece of fabric caught on a low branch. It was tan, maybe from a jacket or pants. When I picked it up, I saw it was fresh, torn recently. The edges weren't frayed, just ripped. I looked around the woods, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the forest was still and empty. As I loaded the last of my gear into the truck, I caught a faint smell on the wind, something acrid, like burnt rubber or oil. It came and went quickly, but it made my stomach twist. I got into the truck and drove out fast, bouncing along the rough dirt road until I hit pavement. Only when I was miles away did I finally relax enough to look in the rearview mirror. The forest was shrinking behind me, dense and black. Later that day, I stopped at a small ranger station to tell them what happened. I described the tracks and the noises. The ranger didn't look surprised. He said that sometimes squatters or illegal hunters stayed deep in those woods, and they didn't like anyone camping near them. They'd move quietly through campsites at night, checking for food or supplies. He said they usually avoided confrontation, but they'd been known to stalk campers to scare them off. That explanation fit, but it didn't make me feel better. The way those steps circled my tent, the dragging sound, the careful way whoever it was moved, it all felt too deliberate, too personal. I wasn't just being scared off. They were watching me, waiting. I never camped alone again after that. I still go out sometimes with friends, but never by myself. And even now, whenever I'm out in the woods and the night goes completely silent, when the wind stops and the insects fade, that same cold feeling crawls up my spine. I always remember that sound from the dark, the slow drag across the leaves, and I wonder if whoever was out there that night is still in those woods, waiting for the next person to sleep too deep by the fire. I went camping in late September, alone, in a small stretch of forest that bordered the edge of an old logging area in Idaho. It wasn't an official campground, just a rough clearing I found using satellite maps. I wanted total quiet, somewhere far from people and noise. I had a small pickup, a tent, and 3 days off work. The idea was to get some peace, maybe take photos of the trees changing color before the cold set in. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, which was a mistake I realized too late. The drive took nearly 5 hours from the nearest town. The dirt road leading into the forest was narrow and full of ruts, lined with pine trees so tall they blocked most of the sunlight. I remember how still everything was once I parked. Not even birds. The ground was covered in layers of needles, and the air smelled like damp earth and resin. I set up my tent about 30 yards from my truck, near a small rise that overlooked a dry creek bed. It looked like a perfect spot, private and quiet. That first day was calm. I walked down the creek bed for a while, exploring. It was mostly dry except for a few muddy patches where water still seeped through. I saw a few deer tracks and something larger that might have been elk. The forest felt untouched. No litter, no old fire pits, no signs of other campers. I liked that. I spent the afternoon taking pictures, collecting some dry branches for firewood, and cooking a simple meal on my portable stove before sunset. When it got dark, I sat by the small fire and listened to the forest. It was one of those nights where the silence feels so heavy it almost hums. I slept fine until around 3 in the morning. I woke up to a faint crunching sound outside the tent. My first thought was an animal, maybe deer. I stayed still, listening. The steps were slow, uneven, and light, like someone trying not to make noise. That's what made my stomach tighten. Animals move differently. They aren't careful like that. The sound circled around my tent once, then stopped. I didn't move for at least 15 minutes, just staring up at the ceiling of the tent, waiting for something else. Nothing happened after that, and eventually I must have fallen back asleep. The next morning, the air was cold and damp. I stepped outside to check around the tent and saw faint impressions in the soil. Not paw prints, but the tread pattern of boots. They weren't mine. They led from the tree line around my tent and then back into the woods. They weren't deep enough to be old, and the soil there held impressions easily. Whoever it was had been there that night. I remember standing there for a long time, just staring at those marks, trying to make sense of it. There were no other campsites nearby, no cabins, no trails. The nearest road was miles away. I didn't hear an engine or see any lights the night before. I tried to stay calm, told myself it might have been a hunter passing through, someone checking the area, but the thought of them walking around my tent in the middle of the night didn't sit right. I decided to stay anyway, though I kept glancing toward the woods all morning. I cooked breakfast, took a short hike, but I couldn't relax. Every snapped twig or rustle made me look over my shoulder. Around noon, I found something about 50 yards from my campsite. A small piece of tarp partially buried under leaves, like someone had tried to hide it. It was old, faded blue with frayed edges. Underneath it were a few rusty cans, a broken folding knife, and an empty lighter. It looked like someone had been camping there months ago, maybe even last year, but it still felt wrong. The tarp hadn't been there long enough to be swallowed by the forest completely. That night, I built a larger fire than usual, trying to push the darkness back. I didn't like how the trees seemed to crowd closer once the sun disappeared. I sat there for a while, staring at the fire, and noticed something across the creek bed. A faint glint, like light reflecting off glass. I pointed my flashlight in that direction, but it was too far. The reflection disappeared. I scanned again and saw nothing but trunks and brush. I turned the light off, thinking maybe it was just dew on a branch. I went to bed but couldn't sleep deeply. The forest felt awake that night. Every sound stood out, the faint snapping of twigs, the shifting of wind through the branches, and the occasional drip from condensation on the tent. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard movement again, closer this time. It was coming from the direction of the creek. I held my breath and listened. Slow, deliberate steps. I could hear the crunch of dry leaves, the pause, then another crunch. The sound came up from the creek, crossed the clearing, and stopped right outside the tent. I didn't move a muscle. My heart was pounding so loud I thought whoever was out there could hear it. The footsteps stopped completely. I could sense someone standing there, maybe only a few feet away. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard a slow dragging noise, like a stick being pulled along the ground. It circled half the tent, then stopped again. I kept one hand on the flashlight and the other on the knife beside my sleeping bag, ready to strike if the zipper moved. The sound faded after a minute or two, replaced by silence. I stayed awake until sunrise, shaking, waiting for something else to happen. When the first light came through the tent fabric, I stepped outside immediately. The ground was disturbed. Shallow marks, boot prints again, and long drag lines circling the tent. It looked like someone had traced the perimeter with something. I checked my truck. Nothing missing, but one of the side mirrors was tilted down like it had been touched. I saw no one, but the forest felt alive with presence, like eyes watching from somewhere deep inside. I didn't even eat breakfast that morning. I packed fast, throwing everything into the back of the truck without caring how it fit. I wanted to get out of there. As I walked to the driver's side, I noticed something caught in one of the low branches a few yards away, a thin strip of fabric. When I pulled it free, I realized it was from a jacket sleeve, dark green, torn. It looked fairly new. As I drove out, the forest seemed to close in tighter. The road was rough, and I kept checking the rearview mirror. At one point, I thought I saw movement behind me, a flash of color between the trees, but it was gone in an instant. It took almost an hour to reach the paved road again, and when I did, I stopped just to breathe. Later that afternoon, when I reached a gas station, I went inside and told the clerk there might be someone living out in that forest, possibly watching campsites. He didn't look surprised. He said a few hikers had mentioned weird encounters that summer. Food missing, tents cut open while people slept, and even a case where someone woke up to find boot prints circling their camp. No one had ever caught whoever it was. They figured it was a squatter or an old logger who'd gone off the grid. Driving home, I kept replaying the sound of those slow footsteps and that dragging noise circling my tent. I thought about how close they'd been, how they hadn't tried to steal anything, how they just walked around me in the dark. It made me realize that the scariest thing in the woods isn't the animals or the night itself. It's knowing someone might be out there, completely silent, completely human, watching you without a word. I never camped alone again after that. Even now, years later, every time I hear leaves crunching underfoot at night or see light reflecting from the woods, it brings that feeling back. The heavy silence, the sense of being surrounded by eyes I couldn't see, and the absolute certainty that someone had been standing just beyond the thin fabric of my tent, waiting for me to move. I went camping alone in the middle of July last year, deep in the woods of northern Colorado. I'd been there once before with a group of friends and remembered how isolated it was. No trails, no phone signal, no cabins for miles. It was one of those places where the world felt untouched. The trees grew thick and tall, and the air always smelled heavy with pine and wet soil. I'd been working nonstop for months and wanted a break from everything. No noise, no people, no screens, just quiet. I drove up on a Friday morning, following a narrow dirt road that twisted uphill through the forest. The road was barely wide enough for my truck, and the branches scraped against the sides as I went higher. I found the same clearing we'd used before, a small patch of level ground surrounded by pines and boulders, with a thin creek running about 100 feet away. It looked perfect. The forest around it was thick and shadowy even in daylight. I set up camp, my tent near the edge of the trees, a folding chair by the fire pit I built with flat stones, my cooler and gear lined up neatly beside the truck. The air was hot but still, and the sound of water trickling through the creek gave the whole place a calm rhythm. I spent the afternoon exploring, walking through the woods with a small backpack and taking note of landmarks so I wouldn't get turned around. I found an old rusted hunting stand nailed high in a tree, probably decades old, and a few fallen logs with claw marks from bears. Nothing unusual for that area. By sunset, I had a fire going and cooked a simple dinner, just beans, bread, and coffee. The orange glow lit up the trunks around me, but beyond the circle of light, everything fell into blackness. The forest at night always feels heavier, like the darkness presses in from all sides. I sat there for hours listening to the sounds, crickets, frogs, the occasional rustle from small animals in the brush. It was peaceful. When I finally put out the fire and crawled into the tent, the temperature had dropped sharply. The ground was cool through the thin padding of my sleeping bag. Sometime during the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know what had pulled me out of sleep at first. The fire was long gone, and the forest was completely silent. Not the normal kind of quiet, it felt unnatural, like every living thing had stopped moving. I lay there in the dark, trying to hear the creek, but even that seemed muted. Then, faintly, I heard a crunching sound, slow, irregular footsteps on dry leaves. It wasn't close at first, maybe 50 or 60 feet away. It would move a few steps, stop, then start again. I stayed perfectly still, my heartbeat loud in my ears. The sound kept circling, slowly, staying just far enough that I couldn't tell what direction it was coming from. It would pause for long stretches, then pick up again, each step deliberate, like someone trying not to make noise. The more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't an animal. The pace was too careful, too slow. My throat went dry. I stayed frozen like that for what felt like an hour until the sound faded completely. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I stepped out into the cold gray light of dawn. The air felt thick with moisture, and the forest smelled earthy. I walked around the perimeter of my camp, checking for signs of animals or anything disturbed. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't paw prints, they were boots. The tread was deep in the soft dirt, leading from the treeline, circling behind my tent, and then back out toward the woods. They were big, maybe size 11 or 12, and definitely recent. I stood there for a while, trying to make sense of it. There was no reason for anyone to be out there. The nearest road was miles away. I'd seen no other vehicles or people the whole drive-in. It crossed my mind that maybe it was a hunter or hiker, but the way the tracks looped around my tent made me uneasy. They weren't just passing by. Whoever it was had been standing there, close enough to touch the fabric if they'd wanted. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was overreacting. Still, I couldn't relax. I spent most of the day uneasy, walking a little farther down the creek to distract myself, but my eyes kept scanning the trees. I kept expecting to see movement between them. Every now and then, I'd catch the faint sound of branches snapping or the whisper of leaves, and my stomach would tighten. By late afternoon, clouds had moved in, thick and gray. The forest dimmed earlier than usual. I built the fire up higher than the night before, needing the light. I sat close to it, watching the smoke drift into the air. The wind started to pick up, and the trees swayed and creaked. I kept turning around, glancing at the shadows beyond the firelight, half expecting to see someone standing there. When I finally went into the tent that night, I left my flashlight beside me, already switched on. The air was colder, and the sound of the wind made the tent fabric ripple softly. I must have drifted in and out of shallow sleep for an hour before I heard it again. That same slow crunch of footsteps. My stomach dropped instantly. It was closer this time. I turned off the flashlight, not wanting to give away any movement. The steps came from behind the tent again, then stopped. I could hear the faint rustle of fabric as if something brushed against it. My whole body went stiff. Then, nothing. Total silence. After several minutes, I heard a faint metallic sound, like metal scraping rock. Came from near the fire pit. I couldn't see it, but I pictured someone crouching near my gear, going through it. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. I wanted to unzip the tent and run for the truck, but I didn't dare make a sound. I lay there for what must have been an hour, waiting for another noise. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep out of sheer exhaustion, though I don't remember it happening. When I opened my eyes, the sky outside was pale blue. I sat up immediately and unzipped the tent. The fire pit was cold, and my gear was scattered. My pan was a few feet from where I'd left it, the lid of the cooler was open, and a few items from my bag were missing, mostly food. But something else caught my eye. On the log where I'd been sitting by the fire, there were boot prints on the top of it, as if someone had stood there watching the tent. I packed up as fast as I could. My hands were shaking the whole time. Every crack of a branch made me flinch. When I was loading the last of my things into the truck, I noticed something odd near the edge of the creek. A torn strip of cloth hanging from a branch, dark green, like from a jacket. It looked new. The fabric fluttered lightly in the wind. I didn't touch it. I just got in the truck and left. The road out felt even narrower than before, the trees pressing in on both sides. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, convinced I'd see someone walking along the road behind me. I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station nearly 40 miles away. When I got out, I realized how tense my shoulders had been the whole drive. My heart was still pounding. Inside the station, I told the guy working there that I thought someone had been watching my camp. He said it wasn't the first time he'd heard that. Apparently, a few people who'd camped up there had seen signs of someone living in the woods, off the grid. He said they'd sometimes sneak around campsites at night, stealing food or supplies. That made sense, but it didn't make me feel any better. Whoever had been there hadn't just stolen, they'd watched. They'd walked around my tent in the dark, close enough for me to hear them breathe, testing how far they could go without waking me. I've been camping since then, but never alone. I can't. The thought of lying in that tent again, surrounded by darkness, listening to the slow crunch of someone's boots circling me in silence, it still makes my skin crawl. And sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night at home, I swear I can still hear that faint, dragging sound in the back of my mind, moving closer through the dark, just like it did out there. I went camping alone last summer, sometime in late August, mostly because I needed a break from people. I live in a small town and work long hours at a warehouse, and I hadn't done anything for myself in months. I'd been feeling stuck in a routine: work, home, sleep, repeat. I wanted to clear my head, so I decided to spend a few days out in the woods, far away from traffic and noise. I didn't have a specific plan. I just picked a random area near a lake I'd seen on a map, about 2 hours north of town, and figured I'd find a spot to camp once I got there. The drive up was quiet. The highway turned into back roads, and the back roads turned into dirt paths lined with tall trees. The weather was good, warm, clear, just enough breeze to keep the air moving. I had my tent, sleeping bag, small stove, and a cooler in the back seat. I reached the lake area around midday and parked off a narrow dirt trail that led deeper into the forest. The spot wasn't an official campground. There were no signs or marked trails, which made it even better for me. I wanted to be away from everyone. I started hiking with my backpack and tent, following a narrow trail that wound around the lake. The ground was uneven, covered with leaves and roots that stuck up just enough to catch your boots if you weren't careful. Every now and then, I'd stop to listen. The woods were full of distant sounds. Insects, birds, water splashing gently against the rocks near the lake. It was peaceful in a way that almost felt strange, like I had stepped out of the world for a bit. After about 40 minutes, I found a small clearing near the edge of the lake. The ground was mostly flat, with soft dirt that would make sleeping comfortable. There were trees all around, but enough open space for sunlight to come through. I dropped my bag and just stood there for a moment, taking it all in. It was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat. I set up my tent facing the water, gathered a few rocks to make a small fire ring, and stacked some dry branches nearby. Once everything was set up, I sat by the water and watched small fish swim close to the surface. I remember thinking how still everything felt. No boats, no people, no signs of anyone at all. The first day was perfect. I cooked some noodles on my small stove, watched the sun go down across the water, and sat by the fire until it got dark. The air cooled down fast once the sun disappeared, and the woods around me became a black wall of trees. I could still hear the soft lapping of water and the occasional pop of the fire. It was calm, but also strange how quickly the world went from bright and alive to completely silent. When I went into my tent for the night, I felt that mix of peace and alertness that comes with being alone outdoors. You feel safe but aware of every single sound. I fell asleep listening to crickets, thinking how good it felt to disconnect from everything. At some point in the night, I woke up to a noise outside. It wasn't loud, just a small crack, like someone stepping on a stick. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I stayed still and listened. Then it happened again, closer this time. Slow, deliberate crunching in the dirt, like footsteps. I held my breath and stared at the faint outline of the tent ceiling above me. The steps stopped for a few seconds. Then I heard the sound of something brushing lightly against the side of my tent. Not a big shove, but a slow, dragging sound, like fingers trailing over fabric. I froze. My heart was hammering so hard that I could hear it in my ears. I reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on. I just listened. The sound stopped. Then, after maybe half a minute, I heard a splash from the direction of the lake. Not a big one, more like someone stepping into shallow water. I stayed awake for hours after that, too scared to move, waiting to hear more sounds. Eventually, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, it was light outside. When I stepped out of my tent that morning, everything looked normal. The lake was calm, and there was no sign of anything unusual. But when I looked at the dirt near my tent, I noticed footprints. Not animal tracks, shoe prints. Barely visible, but there. They came from the tree line, circled halfway around my tent, and stopped at the water's edge. My stomach dropped when I realized the direction of the prints. They came from the forest, not the trail I had walked in on. I told myself maybe someone was camping nearby and just wandered through by accident. I checked the area for signs of another campsite. No smoke, no sounds, nothing. The woods were completely still. I tried to shake it off and spent the morning fishing and walking along the lake. But I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. That evening, I rebuilt the fire and made sure it was bigger than before. I kept the flashlight and a knife next to me just in case. As the sun went down, I noticed something odd. A faint smell, like smoke, but not from my fire. It was coming from deeper in the woods behind me. I walked a little way toward it, maybe 30 feet, but didn't see any flames. The smell was faint but distinct, almost like someone else had a campfire far away. That made me uneasy, knowing someone might be out there watching without saying anything. When it got dark, I stayed by the fire until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up tight, and tried to sleep. For a while, all I could hear was the faint hiss of the fire dying down and the usual forest sounds. Then, sometime after midnight, the silence returned, that complete, heavy kind of quiet where even the bugs stopped making noise. Then I heard it again, footsteps. Not fast, not loud, but steady. I lay perfectly still, staring at the faint outline of my backpack in the dark. The steps circled around the tent slowly. At one point, I heard breathing, not mine. Slow, steady breathing coming from just outside the thin layer of fabric. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The footsteps paused, and I could hear faint crunches in the dirt as if someone was crouching. Then, for maybe a full minute, there was nothing. Finally, the sound started again, this time fading toward the water. I heard another soft splash and then silence. When morning came, I didn't waste any time. I stepped outside and checked the ground again. More footprints. Clear this time, deeper, like someone had been standing still for a while near the back of my tent. They led straight to the water and vanished where the shallow end began. I followed them to the edge and looked across the lake. On the far side, just barely visible through the morning mist, I saw what looked like a narrow trail climbing up a small ridge. I broke camp in record time. My hands were shaking as I packed, and I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting someone to step out. As I was loading my bag, I noticed something sitting on a rock near where I'd stacked my firewood. A small piece of cloth, dark and folded. I picked it up with a stick. It looked like part of a shirt sleeve, torn at the edge, damp and muddy. I hadn't brought anything like that. I stuffed everything into my pack, grabbed my gear, and started hiking back. The whole way, I kept looking over my shoulder. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. Every sound made me jump. Branches creaking, squirrels moving through leaves, even the wind. I didn't stop until I saw the glint of my car through the trees. When I got inside, I locked the doors and just sat there for a minute, trying to slow my breathing. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely put the key in the ignition. The entire drive home, I kept checking the rearview mirror, even though I knew how crazy that was. Later that night, when I got home, I unpacked my bag in the garage. I noticed something strange. The knife I had left beside my sleeping bag was gone. I know I didn't pack it because I remember keeping it within reach that night. It wasn't in the tent, wasn't in my car. It was just gone. I've gone hiking a few times since then, but I've never camped alone again. There's something about being watched out there, knowing someone was standing inches from your tent in the dark, that sticks with you. I never saw their face, never heard a word, but that made it worse. Because whoever was out there wasn't trying to rob me or talk or scare me off. They were just watching, waiting, and for reasons I'll never understand, they left without a trace except for the footprints and the missing knife. It was early September when I decided to spend a weekend camping alone in the mountains. I had been working nonstop for months and felt like my head was packed full of noise. Endless screens, messages, people. I wanted silence, isolation, and that sort of stillness you can only get when there's no signal and no one around for miles. I picked a spot I'd seen marked on a hiking forum, not an official campground, just a small clearing near a creek deep in the forest. It looked peaceful and remote, which was exactly what I wanted. I left early that Friday morning and drove about 4 hours until I reached the forest access road. It was rough, dirt and gravel, full of potholes, and lined with trees so thick they seemed to form a tunnel. My small car groaned as I crawled over rocks, the branches scraping along the sides, making a hollow, dragging sound that got under my skin after a while. The road narrowed until it was barely wide enough for one vehicle. I kept going until I reached a point where the trees opened up slightly and there was enough room to park off to the side. I left my car there and started walking with my backpack and tent. The trail wasn't marked, just a faded path through tall grass and roots. The air was heavy, full of pine and the faint smell of damp soil. I could hear the constant hum of insects and the occasional distant crack of branches, maybe deer or squirrels. After about an hour of hiking, I found the clearing I'd seen online. It was small but perfect, a flat patch of dirt surrounded by trees, with a stream running about 20 feet away. The sound of the water made the whole place feel peaceful, like white noise that hid every other sound. I unpacked slowly, enjoying the quiet. I set up my small two-person tent, gathered wood for a fire, and filtered some water from the stream. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, throwing golden light across the camp. Everything looked calm and untouched. I remember feeling proud of myself for actually doing this. No phone, no one around, just me and nature. I cooked a small meal on my camp stove, watched the light fade, and sat by the fire until it was almost dark. When night fell, it got colder than I expected. The forest around me went from a calm hum to dead quiet. I could hear the creek faintly, but everything else was still. I got into my sleeping bag and laid there listening to the faint popping of embers from the fire dying down. The silence was nice at first, but after a while, it started to feel unnatural. You notice every sound out there, every twig snapping, every shift of the wind through the trees. Around midnight, I heard something faint in the distance. It wasn't close, just the sound of a branch breaking. I told myself it was an animal and tried to fall asleep, but the noises kept coming. Faint, irregular crunching sounds, like footsteps in leaves, slow and uneven. I tried to ignore it, but it started to sound like it was circling the clearing, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. I held my breath and listened hard. It would stop for a few seconds, then start again in a different direction. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon, but it felt heavier than that, slower and deliberate. I didn't move for a long time, just laying there frozen, staring at the roof of the tent. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to early morning light and the sound of birds. The air was cold and still, and everything outside looked normal. I checked the area around the camp, expecting to see footprints or some sign of an animal, but there wasn't much, just my own tracks from the day before. The dirt was dry and hard, so if something had walked through, it didn't leave marks. I told myself I had probably exaggerated it in my head. Sleep deprivation and darkness do strange things to your mind. That day, I hiked a bit upstream, following the creek through the trees. The deeper I went, the more overgrown it got. Fallen branches crisscrossed the water, and the ground turned soft and muddy. I found a small ridge with a good view of the valley and sat there for a while, eating a granola bar and just looking around. The forest stretched out in every direction. Endless trees, hills, and no sign of people anywhere. It was beautiful, but it also hit me how truly alone I was. When I got back to camp later that afternoon, something small but unsettling caught my eye. The pile of firewood I had stacked the night before was scattered around. A few pieces were halfway across the clearing. It wasn't wind, they were heavier logs, and they looked like they'd been thrown, not rolled. I stood there for a while staring at it, trying to think of a logical reason. Maybe an animal had messed with it. Maybe I'd accidentally knocked them when leaving. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. As the sun went down again, I built the fire higher than before. The air felt thicker that night, like there was electricity in it, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing into the dark tree line, half expecting to see movement. Every so often, I'd hear small sounds, quick rustles, short cracks, but never close enough to see anything. The worst part was how the forest went completely silent whenever the noises happened, like even the insects were listening. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept drifting off, waking up, staring at the tent walls. At one point, I heard something that made my stomach drop, the distinct sound of a zipper. It wasn't mine, but it was close, like a tent zipper being slowly undone. I froze. I didn't move or breathe for several seconds, trying to make sure I wasn't dreaming. The sound stopped abruptly, and the only thing I could hear was my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I waited what felt like forever before grabbing my flashlight and unzipping my tent a few inches. Nothing, just darkness and fog hanging low to the ground. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was still. I scanned around with the light, moving it slowly from tree to tree. Nothing moved. No eyes reflecting, no animal. Just the empty woods. I sat up for the rest of the night, staring toward the trees until the sun finally started to rise. When daylight came, I packed my things. I didn't even eat breakfast, I just wanted to leave. But before I took down my tent, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. About 30 feet away, near the edge of the clearing, the ground looked disturbed. There were faint marks in the dirt, long and narrow, like someone had dragged a stick or maybe the toe of a boot. They led in a half circle around my camp, stopping behind a cluster of trees. I walked over carefully and looked closer. There, pressed into the dirt near one of the roots, was a clear footprint. Not an animal, a human one. It was barefoot. The toes were deep, the arch long, and it faced toward my camp. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to process what that meant. Someone had been walking around my camp in the middle of the night, watching, maybe even touching my tent. I didn't even bother rolling my tent properly. I stuffed it into my pack, grabbed my gear, and left as fast as I could. Every sound on the walk back to the car made my nerves jump. Snapping twigs, rustling leaves, even the sound of the creek. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following. I didn't stop until I reached the road and saw my car sitting there untouched. When I finally started driving, I didn't look back once. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away. I sat in the car for a long time before I could even get out, just replaying everything in my head. That night, when I got home, I checked the photos I had taken on my phone. I had snapped one of the campsite right after setting it up. Clear blue sky, trees, the creek in the background. But when I zoomed in, my stomach turned. In the far right corner of the image, between two trees, there was what looked like a figure. Not close, but visible. Someone standing halfway in shadow, facing the camera. I hadn't seen anyone there when I took it. That was the last time I camped alone. Last July, I decided to go on a solo camping trip up in the northern woods. I'd been meaning to do it for years, but always made excuses. I worked night shifts, barely slept right, and just felt stuck in a routine that never changed. I wanted peace and quiet, far away from people, noise, and lights. I didn't care if I was alone. In fact, that was what I wanted most. No one talking, no one near me, just the sound of trees, water, and wind. I picked a spot near a small lake I found on an old map online. There wasn't much about it. No official campground, no facilities, just a rough trail that led somewhere near the shoreline. It looked perfect. The plan was to spend 2 nights there, hike a bit, maybe fish, and just get some space from everything. The drive up took nearly 5 hours. The farther I went, the quieter it got. The highway turned to cracked asphalt, then to a long dirt road filled with ruts and potholes. Tall pine trees lined both sides, crowding out the sun. My cell signal disappeared about halfway up. I didn't care. That was the whole point. I parked my car in a small pull-off spot near the start of the trail. It wasn't even a real parking area, just enough space for one vehicle between trees. The air was thick with the smell of pine and wet soil. I threw on my backpack, grabbed my gear, and started hiking. The trail was overgrown and narrow. Fallen branches crossed it here and there, and the ground was soft from recent rain. I could hear insects buzzing and the distant sound of running water, which I assumed was the lake. It took me close to an hour to reach it. When I broke through the last line of trees, the view hit me. Calm water stretching out like glass, surrounded by dense forest. There wasn't a single ripple, not a single sound but the faint movement of leaves in the breeze. I picked a flat area near the water's edge to set up camp. I laid down my tarp, set up my small tent, and built a little ring of rocks for a fire pit. The ground was damp but firm. My boots left shallow prints in the mud near the water, and I noticed animal tracks there too. Probably deer. The place looked untouched, like nobody had been there for months. The afternoon passed quietly. I collected some dry wood, boiled lake water through my filter, and made a simple meal of instant rice and tuna. The light through the trees shifted slowly from gold to orange, and by the time I sat down near the fire, the sun was sinking behind the trees across the lake. The reflection on the water looked almost too still, like a mirror. When the night came, the air cooled fast. The forest turned dark, pitch black beyond the firelight. It was so silent it made my ears ring. I sat for a long time, just staring at the fire, thinking about how far I was from everything. No cell service, no houses, no roads. It was peaceful, but the kind of peaceful that makes you aware of every single noise. Around 10 p.m., I crawled into my tent. I left the fire smoldering low outside, zipped the door, and laid in my sleeping bag listening to the faint crackle of burning wood. For a while, it was relaxing. Then, sometime later, I woke up. I didn't know what time it was, but the fire had burned out, and everything was silent. I lay still, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, a faint crunch. Leaves and twigs breaking somewhere nearby. It wasn't constant. Just one or two crunches, then silence. Then again, a few seconds later. I froze, holding my breath. The sound wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It came from behind the tent, near the tree line. I thought maybe it was a deer or raccoon, but the steps were slow and spaced out, heavier than an animal's. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The noise stopped after a while, and I eventually drifted off again, but my sleep was shallow and restless. The next morning, everything looked normal. The ground was damp with dew, the water still, the trees perfectly calm. I stepped outside and walked a bit around the campsite. When I got near the back of the tent, I noticed footprints. Not boots, bare feet. The prints were faint but clear in the soft dirt, long and narrow, toes pressed deep. They circled partway around my tent, stopped near the fire pit, then led back toward the woods. For a few seconds, I just stared at them. My brain tried to come up with explanations. Maybe I'd made them myself somehow, though I knew I hadn't been barefoot. Maybe someone else had camped here before and the prints were old. But they looked fresh, edges sharp, no leaves blown over them. I felt a tightness in my chest that didn't go away. I kept busy the rest of the morning, collecting more firewood, checking the edges of the lake, anything to keep my mind off it. I told myself it was fine, that I was overreacting, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. By afternoon, clouds rolled in. The air got heavier, and the light dimmed fast. I could smell rain coming. I cooked another simple meal and decided to turn in early once the drizzle started. The rain on the tent was steady, soft at first, then heavier. The steady tapping was almost soothing. For a while, I managed to relax. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke again. The rain had stopped. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. I heard a noise outside, faint at first, then clearer. Something metal clinking softly. My heart jumped when I realized it was coming from my cooking pot, which I had left outside near the fire pit. The pot shifted again, scraping lightly on the rocks. I sat up, every muscle tense. The sound stopped. Then, another sound, soft, slow footsteps in wet dirt. They came closer toward the tent. I could hear each step clearly. The sound stopped right outside. Then silence. I stared at the tent wall, my breathing shallow. The thin fabric moved slightly near the bottom corner, like something brushed against it. My chest tightened. I didn't move. For maybe 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then, slow breathing. Not animal breathing, slow, steady, human. My hands shook as I reached for my flashlight. I didn't turn it on, just held it tight. Ready. The breathing stopped. A few seconds later, I heard the faintest sound. The zipper tab of my tent shifting, just slightly, like someone had brushed against it. That was it for me. I sat frozen until dawn. When light finally started filtering through, I unzipped the tent and stepped out slowly. The first thing I saw was the ground, fresh footprints, bare, deep from the wet soil. They circled around the tent, just like before, and led back into the woods. My pot was on its side, a few feet from where I left it. Nothing else was taken, nothing else touched, but the prints were new. I packed up everything in a rush. I barely ate, barely checked to see if I left anything behind. I just wanted to be gone. As I started down the trail, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. About 30 feet from camp, on the side of a tree, there were scratch marks. Not claw marks, but straight lines like someone had dragged a knife or rock down the bark. 3 long cuts, deep and deliberate. I stopped for half a second, staring, and then kept walking. The hike back felt longer than it had on the way in. Every time the wind moved through the trees, I flinched. Every sound, a twig snapping, a bird taking off, made me spin around. I didn't see anyone. When I finally reached the car, I felt a huge wave of relief just seeing it sitting there untouched. I threw my pack in the back, got in, and locked the doors. As I turned the key, I caught something in my side mirror. A shape at the far end of the trail, maybe 20 or 30 feet back, just for a second. Someone standing still between the trees. I couldn't make out details, just the outline of a person. I didn't stay to find out. I hit the gas and didn't stop until I reached the main highway. When I got home that night, I unpacked everything in the garage. My clothes were damp, my tent muddy, and everything smelled like pine and smoke. As I unrolled my sleeping bag to let it dry, something small fell out. A tiny piece of dark fabric, torn, not from any of my clothes. It was coarse and damp, like part of an old shirt. I don't know how it got there. I never saw who was out there, but I know for sure someone was. Someone barefoot, walking through the forest at night, watching my tent, standing only a few feet away while I was trying to sleep. I haven't gone camping since. I still love the outdoors, but now when I drive by the woods, I don't see peace anymore. I see that tent in the dark, the soft sound of breathing outside, and those bare footprints pressed deep into the mud. Proof that someone else was there with me, quiet, careful, and waiting.